Okay, this is problem 3018, which deals with credit risk. In other words, if you sell to your customers on credit, meaning they don't pay you cash or give you a credit card up front, you deliver your product or service and then bill them for it, and they are supposed to pay you later. Well, sometimes you'll find some customers that won't pay, and you'll have lost all that revenue. So the problem they suggested to be reviewed is 18, but you need the information for 17, so I've got them both here. And this is a really interesting problem, and I'm not sure that I'm looking at it correctly. This problem requires a lot of assumptions, but it's a really interesting practical problem, because if you were running a small business, this is a very realistic decision you have to make. Do you spend $95 to credit check every customer, or never credit check a customer, or credit check some customers, not others? Let's take some extreme cases first to sort of look at both ends of the spectrum. Let's say you had a customer that you would never have more than $10 of credit accounts receivable outstanding to them at any one time. Now, accounts receivable are based on revenue. The problem up here says the cost of sales is 85% of revenue. So if you never have more than $10 of accounts receivable outstanding, that means you never have more than $8.50 that you've actually got at risk, because that's the sales price, but the cost of acquiring those goods to sell the customer was only $8.50. So that $8.50 is what you actually have at risk. As an aside, I'll say up here, I think this is poorly worded. Fixed costs are a further 5% of sales. Fixed costs, by definition, don't vary with sales. So the way this is worded makes it sound like it is a variable cost, not a fixed cost. So I don't like that wording. In practical real-world terms, there's rarely purely fixed cost and purely variable cost. But in a problem like this, if something's labeled a fixed cost, then that means, I think it's fair to assume, that means it doesn't change whether you sell $0 or $1 billion. That cost will always remain the same. So I don't like that wording. But this 85% cost of goods sold is generally thought to be a variable cost, varies directly with sales. Okay, so we got this customer that the most we will ever have at risk with them is $10, and we're going to assume that if they ever get up to $10, we'll not sell to them anymore until they've paid that off, so that we can reasonably assume $10 is our maximum that we'll have in accounts receivable, which means we'll never have more than $8.50 at risk. So clearly, in that case, it would make no sense to spend $95 to try to reduce $8.50 risk. Of course, you can go to the other end of the spectrum. If we had a customer that we thought might have $10,000 outstanding in revenue, or accounts receivable rather, which is a reflection of revenue, so times the 85% cost of goods sold or variable cost, that means we've got $8,500 of potential risk there. Well, even if you just average these numbers, default is percent of sales. Let's say you decided, well, I'm not going to do a credit check on them. How much is my risk? Well, the problem says customers fall equally into each of these four categories. So if you don't do a credit check, you don't know which category this customer falls in. So the logical thing to do would be to say, well, since these are equal, just average these. And that actually turns out to be 8%. So if you don't do a credit check, you'd say on average you have an 8% risk of not collecting this. So 0.08, so 8,000 times 0.08, $640 of risk. And at that point, just intuitively, yeah, it's worth spending $95 to reduce the risk of losing $640. Now, there's an assumption, I think, here that you got to make is that if you spend this $95, you reduce the risk to zero. Now, that may not be a realistic assumption, meaning any customer that comes back that is in any of these categories, you just won't sell on credit to them. You'll say you have to pay cash or we're not going to do business. You know, that's not always a realistic assumption, but that's the assumption I'm going to make. If you do the credit check, then you have zero risk of default. So in this case, yeah, clearly makes sense to spend the $95 to prevent a expected cost of $640, $8,500 at risk with an average 8% chance of a default. So those are sort of the extremes for illustration purposes. But what's the precise number? What's the dividing line between customers you will spend $95 to check their credit and customers you won't? So here's the way I would look at that. I would say it costs you $95 to do a credit check. If you don't do it, you've got an 8% chance of a loss. So if you take 95, divide it by 0.08, that gives you $1,187.50. Now what's that? That means if you have an $1,187 risk, in other words, the money at risk, then that's sort of the break even where you would, the dividing line between doing a credit check or not. And we can just sort of spot check that by saying, okay, if we got $1,187.50 at risk and it's an 8% risk of a loss, multiply that by 0.8 and we'll get 95, of course, because we divided by 0.8 over here. So just by algebra, you get 95. Now there's one additional step. That's what you have at risk. But remember, if you're thinking about in terms of sales, that would be your cost of goods sold. So you'd divide by 0.85, pull that up, to get, which is your, if you go back up here, is your cost of sales, which we're assuming is a purely variable cost. You'd get $13.97 and 6 cents. So this would be the break even, the dividing line between a customer that you would have that much at risk. Below that number, probably doesn't make sense to do a credit check using the assumptions we made. Above that number, it probably does make sense to do a credit check. Now there's several assumptions, as I said, built in that. It assumes if you do a credit check, you reduce the risk to zero. Again, that may not be too realistic because you might end up turning a lot of customers away. You might say, okay, I'll take a 2% risk. And we're assuming the cost of goods sold up here is a purely variable cost and that the fixed costs are not relevant. And we're not really considering the time value of money. That you can say there's also some savings if you know a customer is going to be in this category 1. They pay you more quickly. than the category 4s, and so there's some savings there, but I'm neglecting that. So that's an interesting problem. That's the way I would approach it, but I'll be interested to see if your professor has different thoughts. That's all.